welcome to the industry's first Green Media Summit. Hopefully the first annual, yeah. I mean, we're an industry that's not necessarily shy about patting ourselves in the back, but honestly, just like taking an entire day out of all of your busy schedules to sit here and discuss and talk and learn about one singular topic of sustainability is really massive. So, I think the applause for ourselves is really deserving here. So just again, kudos to everyone just for showing up. And I was walking in and noticed that we're literally next door to Hamilton, so just being in the room where it happens is pretty amazing. Sorry, these jokes are gonna be really bad throughout the day, but I'm starting there. But yeah, we're really excited that everyone's here today. I'm gonna start off with giving some context about why we're here, including some actually research we did throughout the industry to understand what type of content, how to even design the day today. So we'll give a lot of that context and then start getting into some of the great speakers and panels that we have lined up for you today. But let's start here with like why we're actually here. And I don't necessarily mean like existentially, we're not going to sit here and talk about our existence or why we're here, but really why we're all in the room together. As I mentioned, we've been at Sharethrough talking to the ad industry for a couple of years now about sustainability, and we started to see there really was this growing appetite to discuss a singular topic like sustainability. And we really saw there were kind of three reasons why we wanted to put on this event, but also why there's such an appetite and why we're at the point where we can fill an entire room like this. Literally had to turn away people from tickets over the last couple of days because we've sold out. So hopefully next year we're going to be an even bigger space. But we're really happy to have this space in general. But really saw these three reasons why we want to put this on, and I think why hopefully all of you are here. First of which is just a responsibility. I think not just professionally, but hopefully personally, a lot of you feel the same, that we just have this just kind of dire need to do whatever we can, both personally and professionally, to kind of fix the kind of dire state that our globe is in. And we have a responsibility to, for future generations and everything, but also to come together as an industry and figure out how can we solve at least the problems of our own industry and improve the sustainability of that. And I want to give some context of what I mean by that, and even what's been happening from more of a macro level, even just in the science community. I think you'll probably hear a lot today about a number of companies working towards this goal of reaching net zero emissions by the year 2030. And a lot of that comes back to what the science community kind of agrees on, is that as a globe, we need to cut our emissions in half by 2030 to avoid going from a 1.5 degree increase in our global temperature to 2 degrees. And that little half-degree difference actually makes a massive difference and can actually lead to almost a doubling of destruction of many of the impacts of climate change. For instance, like even things like doubling the amount of insects that can die, that could completely dismantle our food chain, or the amount that sea levels are going to rise and how many more millions of people are going to be impacted just by that half-degree increase in temperature. And even just going from a partial destruction of our coral reefs to full destruction. So this list kind of goes on, and there's actually going to be a few presentations throughout the day that give more of that macro level view, but actually right after this, Noel Anderson from the American Red Cross is going to give more of that more macro level view of what they're seeing on the front lines of how a climate crisis is impacting the world. And then we'll get into more of the micro level of what we can do as an industry to help do what we can as an industry to improve those problems. And I think that was one of the things that was really eye-opening to us over the last couple of years, and I'm sure a lot of you, just the degree to which the internet and our industry is actually a way bigger part of this emission problem than we even realized. We're at the point where the internet accounts for actually more carbon emissions than the global aviation industry, and that's expected to double by, I think, 2026, just by the growth of internet usage. So really the time is now for us to make this change and come together, and this can have a really big impact on global emissions by helping 4% get down to net zero would be huge, especially considering that digital media powers the internet, and we are a huge part of the problem of that 4% of emissions. And it was some of these equivalents that we started learning about over the last couple of years that really helped put into perspective the degree to which we have this problem. What you're looking at here is what it takes the power it takes to deliver 1 million impressions is the equivalent to about 1 metric ton of CO2, which is the equivalent of one round-trip flight from London to Boston, fully charging over 120,000 smartphones, or the carbon in public enemy number one, 2.4 million plastic straws. So, I think this really helped put in perspective. We're just talking about 1 million impressions here, and most of you are probably talking in hundreds of millions. At Sharethrough, we see hundreds of billions of impressions on a daily basis, so this obviously gets compounded very quickly when you start adding up all the carbon emissions that come from the delivery of our impressions. The good news is, unlike the aviation industry, I was actually talking to Martin Bryan from IPG about this earlier. He's going to be on the agency panel. But unlike the aviation industry, who is still years away from some sort of sustainable fuel source and have a lot of problems to be able to even get to net zero, advertising really does have the opportunity to become one of the first industries to reach net zero emissions. We have a lot more control over our whole supply chain, and there's a lot that we can do to help improve some of just the key features and the way that we use power and create emissions. And we really can become one of the first industries to reach that net zero. And I think that's just really exciting that, again, that all of you are in the room today to talk about that and are so interested in it, and that this is going to spread obviously beyond this and make a huge impact on our industry. The second reason why I think we're all here, obviously, is to learn. I think last year was a big year about learning some of those stats that I just put up there about the degree to which advertising is a huge part of this problem. And I think this year is the year that we learn from those that have, some of the leaders you're going to hear from today, some of the solutions that have already started being created, but also learning about what else we can do both individually and as organizations to make a bigger difference. And we actually just to kind of dig deeper in that are in the process of finalizing this report with AdExchanger, where we surveyed 150 advertisers in brands, agencies, ad tech companies to learn about their sustainability goals, what they still have to learn, how they're measuring emissions, et cetera. So this is going to be published quickly, or in the next couple of weeks. But we took some of the learnings from this survey, and that's how we helped kind of design the day today around some of the panelists and the conversations that you're going to hear later on. So for instance, one of the top priorities when we asked what are the top priorities to help reduce emissions of advertising, number one by far was to educate and study this space. So even that alone is just reason to have this day. But we also want to think about, I'm talking about the supply chain of advertising, of how do we look at this and make a difference? This is the supply chain of how we go. An advertisement goes from a brand to an agency to a DSP to an SSP to a publisher to eventually the end user. And each step along that way, there's emissions from everything from servers and cloud computing and user device, et cetera. That really does add up a lot. And so what we wanted to do is, instead of kind of having disparate conversations about this whole supply chain, is we're going to have panels from each step of that supply chain, so that brands, agencies, DSPs, publishers can talk about what they've learned today, but also what they need from all of you. We're all involved in this whole supply chain. We're not just focused in our one silo, because we need help from everyone else in the whole supply chain to really make a difference. So you'll be hearing from kind of some sustainability experts in each step of that supply path in the panels that are coming up. The other big priority is how we measure emissions and how we create standards around this as an industry. And so you'll definitely hear about that in a number of these panels, but also we have 2 talks specifically dedicated to that. At 10:30, Brian O'Kelly from Scope 3 is going to be talking about what they've learned in their first year of existence, measuring carbon emissions of the digital ad industry, and also, again, what they need to improve on this and what they need from the rest of the industry to keep moving forward. And we're also going to hear at 11:45 from the IAB Tech Lab around how they're creating standards for the industry to be able to measure these carbon emissions at scale, and some of the best practices that are coming out of that can help the entire industry. And another thing we learned from the survey is, it's been great to hear from all the brands, agencies, and ad tech companies that are making these commitments to reach net zero by 2030. We're in the process of becoming one of those. But there's still only about 25% of the companies have made these commitments in our space, and only about 31% are currently tracking their emissions. The good news is that 62% plan to measure their emissions within the next couple of years. And if there's something that we just learned recently at Sharethrough going through this process, it is a steep learning curve of learning how to measure your own carbon emissions. And that's why we're really excited to have Richard Davis, who's the CEO of 51 Carbon Zero, who we're using to help measure our carbon emissions and create a plan to reach net zero. And he's going to go through a process of how you can actually start measuring your carbon emissions as an organization, and something that should be really tangible for you all to bring back to your organizations, and how to accelerate that from within. So stay tuned for that at 1:40. So it's going to be after lunch later today. And then lastly, I think why we're all here is to take action, right? We're not just here to talk and listen, but how can we bring things back to our organizations that are going to make a difference? How can we make a difference across the industry and within our organization, and kind of embrace our inner Greta and start making a difference? And we spoke with pretty much every panelist and speaker that you're going to hear from today about, they're each going to have different focuses, but at the end of the day, we really want two things from every session today, which is, obviously to learn from these leaders about what they've learned to date, but also to make sure there's going to be some actionable solutions and actionable next steps for all of you to, again, bring back to your organizations, so you can leave here with some tangible things that you can bring back, but also what you can do individually to start making a difference from within. And another example of that is John Osborne, who's the director of Net Zero, is going to be talking at 2:40. For any of you that don't know, Net Zero, they're one of the trade groups that's trying to organize our whole industry, create working groups so that we can really make a larger difference and catalyze this move towards net zero emissions. And he's going to be talking about the 5-point plan and how you as an individual can get involved in some of these ways that we're helping to reduce emissions as an industry. And that's a big reason why we've put together this event today at Sharethrough. Is we realized that we are a big part of the problem, seeing hundreds of billions of impressions on a daily basis. So when we learned this a couple of years ago, we knew we wanted to be part of the solution, both from an education standpoint on throwing events like this, but also just like making a difference from within, both from what we do as an organization. We're actually in the process of committing to our net zero emissions by 2030, and as I mentioned, working with 51 to Carbon Zero, and having this really steep learning curve of understanding how to go about this process. And we don't want to just keep that in. We want to help kind of share what we've learned, but also bring together the people that are learning that, and also how to get involved in net zero, how to get involved with companies like Scope 3, but also even how to build technologies that help build more efficient technology that reduces carbon emissions, and even free tools for the industry that I'll talk about in a second. But I think the big stepping stone came from last year when we worked with Scope 3 to launch the industry's first green media product, our green PMPs, which just launched I think last year. And we actually just created this site, greenpmp.io, to basically hold ourselves accountable for showing how many brands are actually running on these types of green supply paths that help actually compensate for measure the amount of carbon that is delivered from ads running across green PMPs, and then compensate for those ads. And so we're holding ourselves accountable for how many emissions are being compensated. And actually soon we're going to be releasing some really interesting case studies around. I think the good thing about products like these that we're seeing is, I think at first there's some hesitancy to ever run on something like this, because all advertisers care about is performance at the end of the day. And the good news is, to date, we've seen that running on products like this either keeps performance the same, or in some cases actually helps improve it. So there's not really any reason not to run on these types of net neutral or ways of compensating for the emissions across our whole supply chain. So we've been really excited to see the growth of this and just the excitement around products like green PMPs. And we also just last week released this new carbon emissions estimator, which is a free tool for actually anyone to use that can actually estimate the carbon emissions from your digital ad campaigns. And it's actually the URL is down there, but you can simply just input the amount of impressions that you're expecting to run, where it's going to run in terms of what types of ads, what type of devices it's running on, and even like the geography of it. And it's going to estimate the carbon emissions based on Scope 3 data and data from our own green PMPs that estimates the amount of carbon emissions from that, and then also give you some equivalents about like what is that equivalent in driving a car or heating a house for X number of years. So again, we're trying to release a lot of these free tools and just kind of education so that this can kind of expand beyond just this room and impact more of the industry. And then lastly, putting together this event, we really wanted to make an attempt to make this a carbon neutral event, and we were a little bit scared about that at first, but I think the good news was it wasn't, well, we're not done with it yet, but it wasn't as hard as we expected. We are working with 51 to carbon zero to measure the emissions from this event, and actually you're going to be getting an email shortly to answer a, I think, 3-question survey about how you got here, so we can even compensate for the transportation of getting to this event. We will have a QR code a few times throughout the event to make sure you take that survey so we can measure the emissions of everyone that attended. But we also, even just working with the event here and just trying to limit things like plastic use and a number of things to help make this as green event as we can. But I think the good news is, like for anyone, I know we do a lot of events in this industry, and it doesn't have to just be sustainability events like this to make them green. Like we can push events to be more green, and I think there's going to be a number of talks today about some of the things that we can do as an industry that outside of just reducing emissions from delivering of advertising, but even our business travel and beyond, that can make a huge difference in how we improve the sustainability of our space and even just personally what we do. Lastly, just a few housekeeping things. You all have like pencils in front of you. Definitely keep those pencils, because when you're done with them, you can actually plant them, and they, I think, turn into like cherry tomatoes or something, which is really cool. We also have some iPads and QR codes going around where you can take a sustainability quiz to kind of learn what you are doing well from a sustainability perspective and where you can improve. And again, don't forget to take that 51 to carbon zero survey that we're going to show QR code for a few times during the breaks coming up. But with that, I do want to get into the actual agenda and some of the other sessions from today. And as I mentioned, first up, we're going to have Noel Anderson from American Red Cross giving that more macro level view. And we're going to have some, obviously great panels and speakers, as I mentioned, throughout this. Again, don't miss after lunch. There's a few great presentations coming up, including that 51 to carbon zero, about how to measure your emissions, and John Osborne from Ad Net Zero talking about that 5-point plan and how you can individually get involved. So definitely stay tuned for those. But with that, I want to introduce to the stage Noel Anderson, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at American Red Cross, and he's going to give some context of, again, that macro context of what's happening across the globe, especially on the front lines of what they're seeing, how the climate crisis is impacting the globe. So please welcome Noel Anderson.